Welcome to Forward Thinking, taking a deep dive into some of the biggest challenges facing real estate and tech today. We meet some of the most inspiring minds in a bid to find sustainable solutions. So as an extension of our Forward Thinking series, I am delighted to welcome Paul Unger from Placetech to a beautiful office in 22 Bishopsgate in the heart of London to come and have a conversation about everything and nothing and prop tech and how you got into journalism and place tech and what you're seeing and certain themes and all that sort of stuff.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you.
That's good to see you. We have known each other a little while, not a long while, but we've always got on well. So it's great to have you here. So what I'm sort of one of the first things I wouldn't mind talking to you about is your life in journalism. Okay. How you started, what the appeal was. I know we talked a little bit beforehand of my sort of fledgling career in journalism, which is, not great, but it'd be really interesting to know how you got into it and how Placetech started.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, starting at the beginning, I started on local papers. I'm a newspaper man.
And is that Liverpool or Manchester?
Liverpool. So after uni, I didn't know what to do, and I was temping for Office Angels in Chester.
Excellent.
Living at home with my mum in Wirral, and working for Welsh Water in the comms department, right, on the two-way radio, sending engineers out to fix leaks and water pumping stations and things. And some friends from my English course at uni had gone to work for local papers, and it sounded more fun than what I was doing, so I sort of copied them and faxed through my CV to the news editor at the Liverpool Daily Post.
As you did.
Indeed, pre-internet, the whole fax and landlines, and the world's very different. And kept on doing that, and they kept on losing it, but eventually got through and had a week's work experience at the Liverpool Daily Post, and stayed for 4 years. Kept on getting asked back, and then eventually got onto the graduate traineeship there. And at the end of 2 years of that graduate programme, there was an opening in the business desk, and I became a business reporter. I'd never thought about business before, and found it really interesting. You're writing about the future. You're writing about the way the world is going to be, new products, new services, new directions for the economy, the way things are going to work. Really enjoyed it, and so that was late 90s. And
did they give you much training, or did they just sort of throw you in the deep end and go, "There you go, Paul. Here's your notepad. Go and find someone interesting to write about"?
There wasn't formal training on sort of financial writing and things like that. There was a lot of training on the basic journalism skills. So I went to the in-house Trinity Mirror, as it was then, their in-house journalism college in Newcastle for 3 months, and did a crash course in shorthand and law and the workings of government. And you learn about interview technique and sort of story composition and things like that. But all the business stuff I just learned on the job with a business editor telling me what to go and ask as I was walking out to interview somebody.
Yeah.
And reading around, reading the FT, and just finding sort of heroes to follow in journalism and copying. Basically using other newspapers as a template, which is good advice generally, isn't it, in life? And
was it your choice then to go onto the business desk, or did you?
No, that was.
I'm assuming when you started, you sort of covered a sort of a myriad of
areas. You work your way around.
Yeah.
So the morning paper, the Daily Post, and the evening paper, the Echo. You work your way around all their departments: features, sports, TV. News, the subs desk, and you learn different skills. If they like you, they sort of make a play for getting you back at the end of your 2-year sort of merry-go-round. There was an opening on the business desk. Somebody left. Somebody went to London, to the BBC, I think, and there was a seat there. I wasn't best pleased at first when I was told I was going there. But
did you want the sport desk?
I don't know what I wanted, probably features or news on the Echo. That was very exciting work, coming in at 7:30 in the morning and working on that day's paper that was going to come out at lunchtime. The old-fashioned sort of evening newspaper. It's very, very happy when I landed on business, and then discovered property and regeneration. And this was the Tony Blair era, and a whole lot of development money going into cities, and the Rogers Report, and John Prescott and Town Centres First, and lots of these big movements. And there was Urban Splash and Beetham and some very big developers that were starting to cut their teeth in the 90s. So you meet big characters, big property developers, and they're more interesting than the manufacturers that I met, or other areas of business. So I started looking for more property stories, and basically became known as a bit of a specialist, and then people come to you with property stories, and it just sort of mushrooms.
You carve out your niche.
Yeah, exactly. And then I wanted to see, I wasn't 100% happy with the way that the papers were run. They're part of PLCs, so they're very short term, they're very fixed on share price. They've got declining sales, which we've seen post-war with the changing way of life, that people don't buy thousands of newspapers at the factory gates and the dockyard gates anymore, and that sort of thing. And the rise of sort of 24-hour rolling news and 5 Live and Sky News and things like that. Newspapers have been suffering declining sales for decades. So PLCs, to prop the share price up, there's only one thing to do in that scenario, and that's cut costs. So year on year, they're making redundancies, and it didn't look like a happy place to stay around. But before I left newspapers, I wanted to see if all newspaper companies were run as badly, and I wanted to see another city as well. So I got a call from an editor in Plymouth on the Western Morning News for Devon and Cornwall. So I went and worked for 12 months, my lost weekend in Plymouth. For the Daily Mail General Trust, or Northcliffe Newspapers, their regional division.
Yes,
and discovered all newspapers are run
as badly as you thought.
They don't know how many copies they sell, they don't know budgets. It's it's a bit of a car crash of an industry.
Wow.
So
I'm assuming then, sort of having done your Plymouth stint and got a suntan and learned how to surf and all that sort of stuff, is it then you thought, I want to go home and maybe do something on my own?
There was certainly a crossroads. That was a big moment, 2001, deciding to leave newspapers. I'd had an offer of doing a sort of fast track management training program within Northcliffe to become an editor. And within a couple of years, you'd get the call and go to Leicester or go to Grimsby or wherever it is and edit there, which is it's quite a tough life. You might be there 6 months or a year or two, and then you get another call, and eventually you get a daily, and you start on the weeklies. And it's not an easy life, but also it's a life of sacking your friends, because you're cutting costs every year, and you find £1 million of savings, and then next year it's how can you find another million? I didn't really want that. So I had friends that I'd met at press conferences and shows and things that were freelance in property. So David Tame, who now, funnily enough, works for us on the Place Northwest side, he was working at EGI, the Estates Gazette Interactive website at the time, and he spoke to me about freelancing and gave me some support, and I ended up sort of taking his Northwest correspondence role off him. He was too busy, he didn't need that 2 days a week retainer, so he concentrated on the features, and I did a couple of years for EGI. And then freelanced for a few years after that. I moved across to Property Week, did a few years of Northwest features writer for them. And then somewhere in amongst, I have to decide whether to tell you the true story or the hype story.
I can see you weighing this up, yeah.
Of how...
Tell me the abbreviated top line.
So if I'm giving the slightly dishonest answer to people, I sometimes say that...
Yeah, I can see that. It's about perception.
I saw this gap in the market where I'd worked for local papers and I'd worked for national trade titles.
Yes.
And seen that there was a lot of activity going on in the northwest of England, in Manchester, Liverpool and elsewhere, that didn't have a home in either local papers who didn't understand property in that sort of specialist way, or in the trade titles that were covering everything in the country, and it had to be of a certain scale of project to get in. It had to be £25 million plus project, and they're covering Edinburgh and Bristol and everywhere else. So there was a lot of activity that people were sending me press releases on that we could cover that didn't have a home. The more truthful answer is that there was a newspaper that launched called the North West Enquirer in 2005, and it didn't last very long. It lasted less than 6 months, and I got the call to launch a supplement within that would come out every other week, and it would be property and regeneration for the Northwest. And I thought regional trade has a ring to it, and that was going to be called Place Northwest, and they were going to do a lifestyle one every other week called Time. So there'd be time and place supplements.
Very nice.
Pulling out of the newspaper, and it never happened. They never got going.
But
I knew when I got that call, I'm going to do that. So I took that idea and launched Place Northwest. And 15 years later, through thick and thin and recession and recovery and everything else, it's still going.
And that almost is a separate entity then to Placetech.
Yeah, so Placetech grew out of Place Northwest. So that launched in 2007, and 2012 was the first time we used the name Placetech for an event. And a law firm approached me to do a conference around data centers, which was a huge thing at the time, and they were taking off and everyone wanted to build and invest in data centers, and they wanted a slice of the action. So we did some events called Placetech that were around smart cities, data centers, etc. And it was the first time I'd thought of technology in property. So I started taking an interest and following it and looking at, is anybody writing about this? There's almost like a new industry coming along, and every industry needs a Bible. Who's writing about the technology for the property industry? And so every 6 months or so, I didn't have plans on a Friday night, and my wife was out. I'd get the laptop out and sit on the lounge floor and just see if anyone was writing about prop tech. And nobody was. So you know how these ideas sort of burn away at you, and you think you've got to do it, otherwise somebody else will do it, and there's an opportunity there.
Did you literally just, so how did you actually start it? I have no idea how you start a journal or a magazine, because I mean, Placetech isn't really a magazine, it's more of an event and sort of interviews and sort of media
analysis, educational content.
Platform, isn't it really?
Trying to explain and help property people navigate into the future and decipher the trends that are changing the industry. Technology being a solution for a lot of them with climate or demographics, etc. You pick a name, you see if you can buy the domain, the URL, and away you go, and launch. And 4 years in, I wouldn't say we've cracked.
So it was 2007 you started it?
2018 Placetech.
Okay, 2018.
2007 Place Northwest.
Okay, so 2018 Placetech.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to think back where we were. So we started in 2005, and like trying to bang your head against a brick wall in terms of educating people, in terms of what we were trying to do, and the whole digitalization, bringing that into the sort of the property world and the real estate world. So 2018. We're quite a long way along the line now.
Yeah.
So 13 years down, I'm just trying to think who was on board. So yeah, 2012, 2013, people were beginning to get the message. So I'm assuming that's probably when you thought, oh, hang on a second, what else is going on here?
Yeah.
So 2018, there's quite a lot of players, there's quite a lot of information around. So it's probably a good time to start.
Yeah, or so I thought.
Good old real estate, eh?
The perception.
Open to change.
I mean, it gone. If one metric is how many press releases you get on a subject.
Yes.
So it went from one a year to one every 6 months to one every month to one a week, two a week.
And this is people sending you stuff that they want.
Property technology related.
Okay, news,
product launches, etc. And so we were talking to as many people as possible about it, and people would tell you interesting stories about what they were doing and the experiments that were going on. Then when we launched, and you go back to those people and you say, will you talk about it on the record and do a story on it?
No, totally different.
So getting people to share their experiences and their experiments has been a challenge, and it's getting easier, but it's still, it's
interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know whether they don't want to give away their trade secrets if they've cracked it, if they found the silver bullet, or they don't want to look stupid if it turns out to be a mistake and a failure. Some people are using it to their advantage, and they are saying, we're changing the industry, we're at the vanguard, we are at the cutting edge, we're leading, and they're using it as a marketing advantage. But still getting some of the detail and getting into the facts and figures and the real sort of business critical stuff, and not just the fluff, is easier said than done. And don't get me started on PR control and expectations and all that sort of thing. Heaven forbid a journalist tries to do some journalism these days.
So you talked about sort of different themes and movements within the sector. So obviously ESG is a big one.
Yeah.
And you probably more than me, although I'm trying to get out and talk to a lot more people these days. You're talking to everybody, and everyone is talking to you. So is ESG? Do you think this is something that the real estate is actually really genuinely running with, or do you see a fair amount of people who are, as I've seen in the digitalization side, it's more of a tick box exercise, or do you think people are actually genuinely embracing this?
It's probably all of the above.
Okay.
There are thousands of companies in property, and everyone's got their own story, their own journey, to use a cliche, and some people are more or less advanced along the path. I would say, to summarize, people are doing things, but there's a lot of people that don't know what to do. So there's a willingness to make a change and take action, but there isn't the overall sort of policy framework, the overall consensus around what to do.
Is that because people don't understand it, or they just haven't? They're sort of saying, yes, we will come to it, but a little bit like CSR, you've got to be a very big business to take people on to actually go and implement the change, and actually maybe people can't do it or are unwilling to do it because it's a lot of effort. And
it's a very big, complex question and subject. You could talk about policy, that the regulations aren't there, governments aren't doing enough, the too short-term sort of vote winner, electoral cycle focused. You could talk about the cost of changing the whole model, the way that buildings are procured, and the willingness of the developer at the top of the pyramid to say, don't all take your 20% at each step in the chain of the procurement process. That means that those LED lights get cut out, even though they're sensible for the ongoing running of the building, because that person doesn't want to take that cost in their part of the cycle. They're just going to cut it out for the sake of tens of thousands of pounds, which isn't much in a big project. You've got some fundamental things like that where the model has to change, and it needs real leadership from the top. Otherwise, you just end up with, it's too difficult, it's too expensive, it's not the way we do it, we'll just build the next building like we built the last one.
Which has been going on for the last, God knows how many hundreds of years, and the construction side hasn't really changed very much. I know there's a whole Contech thing going on as well. Do you get involved in that side of it as well? as opposed to the prop tech side?
It's interesting. It's funny. I don't know if it's social media led or blogs appear on LinkedIn or whatever, and people latch onto them. But it seems like every 6 months or so, people get given a new sheet of song lyrics, and everyone learns the new consensus, and everyone says the same thing. So at the moment, there's a lot about construction tech, Comtech. We're hearing a lot about cement and concrete and more sustainable ways of producing materials and fabric first. Low tech is an interesting area. You don't need more tech necessarily to make a better building.
We'll come on to that in a second.
And I heard a very interesting thing from Fifth Wall at a show earlier this year, and they were talking about all these energy monitoring systems that are very, very popular, and there's lots of them. But they described it as like giving a breathalyzer to an alcoholic, that it doesn't change the behaviour.
Doesn't stop you drinking, yeah.
No, exactly.
Just tells you how much you are drinking.
Yeah, software is not going to change concrete.
No, and I totally agree with you. I think the interesting thing from our point of view, we got into this whole smart environment, smart buildings, is that actually, you know if the lights are on. You don't need to have a monitor. You can just go outside and have a look at it. If you've got the heating on, it's all this stuff. Do you need countless sensors and countless amounts of smart technology? There's so much data floating around that most people don't know what to do with it, don't even know where to start with it. So maybe it does. Maybe it will sort of come back down to actually sort of low tech and actually sort of practicable, relevant technology that you can actually use. I was talking to a client earlier today, and we have a number of different sort of bits of functionality and widgets on our system and what have you, and I would say the majority of people don't use all of our different systems, all of the different functionality. Most of them use maybe 75, probably most of them actually probably more near sort of 50, 55, 60% of it. And yet now they're being, in the marketplace, they're being presented with reams and rafts of different sort of functionality and technology that you've still got your front of house teams and building management teams who are still struggling to sort of use visitor management systems and deliveries and help desk systems, and that's it. And now you're saying, no, you've now got to be au fait with all this other sort of functionality, which they're just never going to use. So you end up fantastic smart systems, brilliant smart systems, doing lots and lots of things and running half the building. But actually with people who at the end of the day probably aren't using a third of that functionality, and then paying through the teeth for all that information and data which they're not actually using.
It's a huge problem, and it's partly a resource issue, that if you can't take the time out in your company for the training and things like that, then it's okay for some of the corporates, the big PLCs, the multi-billion portfolio companies, but the SMEs or the mom and pop companies that can't afford the innovation director or the sustainability director or the time for the training, which is
it's the affordability of it as well. And again, the building I've just been to, which is not a million miles from here, they've got a complete new set of staff. So with the great reshuffle, a lot of people are moving around, and then suddenly you find that you've spent, or we as the contractor have spent, months and months and months getting the front of house team on board and familiar with it and everything else, and using our academy systems and all the videos and everything else. And then within 3 or 4 months, that whole team is gone, or they've got another front of house agency in who aren't familiar with our system, who are then going, okay, well we'll just default back to the sort of the 1 or 2 systems that we're familiar with. So then you've got to start all over again, and the building and then the occupiers are all missing out on that. So it's a challenge for us in terms of keeping up with that. And then also you've then got, because I know you've got 1 foot in London and 1 foot in Manchester, is then how do you price that differently? So there are a lot of very big shiny buildings in London, which everyone is sort of feeding off, but there's also an awful lot of big shiny buildings in Manchester and Birmingham and Glasgow and Leeds and Newcastle and what have you, less. But what about the sort of the smaller buildings? Does that exclude them from this whole prop tech revolution because it's so blimmin' expensive?
And retrofit.
And retrofit.
Is it relative to an Edwardian townhouse that it's got to be it's got to be scalable. Otherwise,
available for everybody.
Yeah, otherwise it's not going to be
No,
worth
and
it.
you're not going to achieve those, as you said, those at scale goals.
And I think that issue between sort of back in the general's tent and the front line, the gap between those two areas on site and then back in head office is a real challenge. And you've seen it with BIM in architecture for the last 20 years, that building information modelling has existed and people have known the logic of it, but it hasn't been adopted because of the problems with getting it to mean something on site. When that guy arrives on Monday morning with a hangover, with a sledgehammer,
I was going to say,
you know,
don't even go there.
if you can't put it in his hands or her hands, then it loses, well, it's lost altogether, isn't it? Its potency and relevance. So unless you make tech really easy to use,
yes, and
like in maybe 2 minutes, 10 minutes max.
Yes.
Otherwise, then,
and you've got to make it massively intuitive.
Yeah.
And when I started the business, it was like, I'm not a technologist. And I just said, it's if I can understand it, that's great. And then starting with those guys, as I call them, in the ivory towers, who are the business entrepreneurs, but they're the leaders and they're the managers, and they have that wonderful sort of umbrella view of where they want their business and their clients' portfolios to be, and we want to have this sort of digital revolution, and that's all great. But it's then getting that message, cascading that message down through the various stakeholders. Yeah. It's a whole program to sort of readjust everyone's views on digital and
the internal
benefits.
The internal politics of how property companies adopt technology is fascinating.
Scary.
Yeah. Not easy, not quick.
No.
Which is sort of similar to what we've seen with the whole hybrid working, the great realignment from COVID. The wrong managers are in the wrong positions, and they don't want to go into the office in the big law firm. They know enough people. I don't need to network anymore, but they're hiring graduates who need their bosses around so they can overhear them and how they handle that conversation on that call.
Yep. I think everybody is suffering from this.
It's going to take years to work through.
And I'm not anti-hybrid, don't get me wrong, and I'm not anti-work from home. And I think, it's the sort of the Monday, Friday thing, and then the TWT days in the middle that most people are coming into it. But we're losing out. And it's the people who are suffering aren't going to be you and me. It's going to be the graduates coming in who have very little work experience or no work experience, who don't understand the machinations of an office, who need to understand that actually not all clients are the same, and you miss out on that, and you miss out on all that conversation, experience, and overhearing stuff, and having a conversation with people. Yeah. But again, the modern working behaviours mean that we've got to not kowtow, but listen to what people want, and work with them. And that's all part of something else we're going to talk about, was the great reshuffle. And again, and the issues that throws up. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good, some of them are healthy, some of them are really unhealthy. On the back of what has been for a lot of people the last 2 years, an incredibly stressful and pressurized time. Again, going back to this sort of, you've got a foot in sort of London and sort of the northwest. Do you see similar things happening in Manchester as you see the trends happening in London?
We're seeing a lot of people move to Manchester.
Right.
A lot of young people move to Manchester, and not necessarily with a job lined up, but just moving to be in Manchester, because knowing that they can get work. It's cheaper than London.
Right.
It's a great place to be. The economy is big enough that there are 5 or 6 jobs that they could go into. It's not just all hanging on one job, and if they don't like that, then they're stuck. And it's a snowball effect that employers go there because there's a good workforce. So the workforce go there because there's the jobs, and it just one goes after the other. It sort of has a London effect across the north then, that it's hard if you're a small business in Preston or Chester or whatever, hanging on to your staff.
You've got to be in Manchester.
It's hard, really hard. It's getting more, it feels more like London every day. It's just busier, just out and about. It thinks it's bloody London with the the price of a pint and the rest of it is ridiculous. The service charge on everything you breathe, and it's 12.5% on it. It's, but it's always been full of itself and very cocky and sure and confident. Manchester is part of its sort of industrial heritage. Love it or loathe it. We could do with levelling up the weather.
Okay.
First. I just got off at
Very
Euston
good.
today. It's prepared for this guy.
Yeah, thank you.
It's always sunny in London. It's
Yes.
not fair. It's always cloudy. We live under a concrete sky in Manchester. So let's level up the weather first.
Speaking of levelling up, can we go there?
Yeah, please
Is that
do.
actually? Do you think that's actually happening? Have you seen any benefit of this?
No,
Anything
it's-
actually concrete happening?
It's a very shallow, superficial set of competitions at the moment. They're asking councils to bid for funding pots, which is leading to some very sort of hasty, sometimes spurious projects being put together to bid for the funding. It's not a grown-up, sensible way of going about doing things, you know, and the tap can be turned off at any time.
And does it stop at Manchester like the HS2, or does it go further?
I mean, Manchester has a very good history of winning bids, and historically...
But no
it's-
further? You think that levelling up goes as far as Manchester and that's it?
No. I think, you know, there's some good things happening in wherever you look. You know, Newcastle, Middlesbrough. There's people working very hard for the tech clusters in their towns and cities. They can't all win the money, and it won't be enough. Levelling up has to be much more comprehensive. It has to be about infrastructure. You know, you look at getting across London. You've got a dozen tube lines. All the roads,
Take your pick.
circulars,
Yep.
all the rest of it. You get from Manchester to Leeds, you've got one motorway, one train line. It's very fragile compared to, and you know, you can pay a lot to get from Manchester to Leeds, and you wait on a platform with cancelled trains. So, you know, sort transport out that you can actually get around the north, and then it opens up access not just to employment, but to medical appointments, just to a quality of life that people should expect. So, yeah, whether it'll survive, you know, Liz Truss didn't have it in her, she didn't mention it once in her campaign. Kwasi Kwarteng hasn't mentioned it in the run-up to taking office. Will it be here in a year's time? It's just one of those political footballs. It could get kicked in the other direction. So.
And do you think the red wall will be reconstructed in 2 years' time?
Well, I'm no political pollster. It'd be interesting to see.
But I mean, you're having conversations with influential people and lots of other people, you know, in London, in Manchester, in the northwest. You must get a feel for the whether it's frustration or celebration, or whether people are pro current, you know, government.
Yeah, I mean, people, I guess, want a voice for the North. They want some sort of coherent, meaningful lobbying at the top. And so they're always looking around the cabinet and looking for northern MPs, northern voices that can be their spokespeople. And that comes and goes. You know how short-lived a minister's career is.
We were at Resi 60 the last 2 days, Resi 360, which is brilliant, good event, probably a big event. And I think it was Mark Easton who was the Home Affairs for the BBC. I think we're on our 13th housing minister in 12 years.
It's just
Kind of
silly,
speaks
isn't it?
volumes,
It's
doesn't
just
it?
silly. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not grown-up politics.
No, it's not.
So you know that would be a start. Everybody knows what the answers are. You know, more devolution, more control over spending, better transport, and just having long-term planning with proper budgets and powers. You know, it'd be great if they could keep some business rates locally and decide what it goes on, not just these very siloed sort of programs handed down from Whitehall. Being able to join up education with housing, with social services, and sort of blend the pots together, spend it in a way that suits that locality. In 2022 we still don't have that. It'll be interesting from a Manchester point of view what happens with Burnham, Andy Burnham, the Mayor for Greater Manchester, the Metro Mayor. There's still rumours that he'll go again for leadership of Labour.
Okay.
Labour haven't been, in my opinion, great opposition for quite a while. All his sort of battling and taking to the streets against Johnson and things like that, who's his audience? Is it really Joe Public and the voters, or is it business? Is it government? So that'll be interesting. There's rumours Gary Neville might throw his hat in.
Yeah,
to
he's very active, isn't he?
Take over from him. Yeah.
Oh, as Mayor of Manchester.
Yeah.
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 That may not be a bad thing.
Well, it depends who you speak to in property in Manchester. He's not universally liked, but
so yeah, I think you're not a massive fan of the trickle down economics then, starting with the bankers.
I don't quite see the logic, but
I don't think anybody does.
No. I mean, free market and Thatcherism returns. At least we're talking about policies.
Yes.
We're not just talking about TV comedians.
No.
And at least there's some policies to debate for once.
Yeah.
And it's shocking, isn't it, really, that's a welcome breath of fresh air, regardless of what the policy is.
Yeah, and we're not talking about the individual, we're talking about the policy, which I guess is better than we have been for the last 2.5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think on the levelling up?
I talked to you about this, and I talked to other people about this. I don't see that a lot has actually happened. I think there are a lot of promises made, and I don't see a lot of that actually being implemented, having been implemented or going to be implemented. And also, if you've got a party, it's like having a business, and we set out a vision and we have values. And just because we change a head of department doesn't mean that you then completely change all your policy and just go, no, we're not going to do that. No, you're a business, and you're a government, and you have policies, and you've all agreed those, and that's what the general public has agreed. So you then go and carry those out. You don't just go, nah, it's not the flavour of the day, so I'm just going to kick that off and go and follow something else. Yeah. So no, I'm gobsmacked.
Bringing it back to tech, you asked about ESG and sustainability. Wouldn't it be great if climate policy was made separate and independent in the same way as the Bank of England?
Yes. And
give it to the experts.
Yep.
Give it to some objective committee to say, this is the 25-year view, this is our target, this is what we're doing, and make it less political.
And make it happen.
Yes.
And have a roadmap.
Yes, exactly.
And get some people on board that will actually make this thing happen.
Yeah, if you've got to take some difficult decisions and bang heads together and be radical and be serious about it, but just lurching from like what's tomorrow's headlines, and I'll just say this to please people, or
going back to that prop tech levelling up side, it is quite interesting because it seems to me that the majority of the sort of the digitalisation revolution, call it what you want, is happening in the south and happening in London. I don't know if that's because service charges are bigger. Do you see that happening Manchester, Northwest?
Yeah, I mean the
adoption rates.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think I've said this for a couple of years that London is a lot of prop tech companies' second office. So you start in New York or Sydney or Johannesburg or wherever, and you prove your concept and you get a viable product in your local market, and then you want the rest of the world, and often you go to London, or New York if you're not there and you want to tackle North America, and you can do Europe, Middle East, Africa through the front door of London. So that inevitably means there's a lot of people here in the pool, and that's going to trickle down to adoption. But there's a lot of independent property developers with their own money at the table, serious, switched on, progressive companies looking to spend, and they can make a quicker decision than some of these big corporates.
Yeah.
So yeah, it definitely is happening. And there's probably a gap for venture funds, for accelerators that know they should be in the north, but they don't really know how to do it. Maybe we should help them.
That's an idea.
Yeah, it is.
Do you think adoption rates, because I mean, again, it's one of the things I keep banging on about here, is the adoption rates are incredibly slow. So people actually picking up the gauntlet and running with any kind of digitalization over and above the big shiny buildings we're talking about here. So it's been slow, and it still is quite slow. But is that similar story? Are you seeing the similar sort of themes in Manchester?
Well, I'm slightly surprised and disappointed to hear you say that I hear a lot from people that it's getting a lot faster year on year, and there are more people doing more things, and it's deeper and broader. Some people even saying we're into the majority stage, you know, the early majority of people adopting technology. So it's slightly concerning to hear that, you know, from the front line of a tech company actually doing it, that adoption is still painfully slow. I think, you know, those people that are starting to have a sort of steering group to look at it is very different. And do you count that as adoption, where they've maybe been to a conference, or they've read something, or written a blog, or whatever?
No.
Or, you know, they've done it in one building, in a pilot building.
No.
That's not a portfolio.
No, and that's not adoption.
No.
I mean, we had, I don't know, we had probably quite a few RFPs in the last sort of 12 months. And these are big portfolios. And they start off with, you know, maybe 300, 400, 500 buildings. And they're saying, we just want to do a pilot for maybe half a dozen buildings for a year and see how it goes. So no, I didn't see that as adoption.
Where do you think adoption, the adoption that does happen?
For us, it's on the ground.
But where do you think it comes from? Does it come from their mates? Johnny uses this one, so we'll use that one, or does it come from consultants?
I think
selling it in, or?
I think the agencies have less and less say in this. So less and less sway over persuading their clients to do it. I think the clients, the landlords, the developers are increasingly stepping up to the plate because they see the importance of it. They also see their portfolio as increasingly a brand, so they don't want to besmirch the brand with something that doesn't work, or has got a bad rep, or isn't going to be here in 18 months' time, whatever. So they are doing more and more of that decision making themselves. So you know, we are much more speaking to sort of the landlords, the owners, the asset owners, rather than going to the agencies. And I've built the business on talking to the agencies. So, and they're still great, and they still provide us with lots of information and business and what have you. But I think their influence may be waning on that side of things. Right. And yeah, there is a lot of referral. A lot of our business is referred, and by reputation. So I think there was, you know, the early, in the last sort of 3 or 4 years, it is perception as well. So I think if you're perceived as having a very you know, modern system that can solve a lot of issues and a lot of problems and can save you money, and you know, the smart sort of, you know, use of words has come out, and people seem to like that. But again, is that adaptable and is that applicable for the majority of buildings? The answer is no, because not everybody wants to have that. Not everybody can afford that. You know, you've got that top 5% of big buildings in Manchester, Birmingham, London, you know, that can afford to do that, and it's a big, all these single buildings are big brands, and they've got to be seen to be doing the latest thing and not be left behind. But that does not apply to your, what I call the tier 2, tier 3 buildings that are, you know, 100,000 square feet, or 50,000 or 20,000 square feet, because they just don't have the service charge to afford that. So what happens then? Do they get left behind? So that's what I mean by take up and scale, is that there are an awful lot of those buildings, and there are an awful lot of companies that are working out what they're going to do. Still, 2022, going into 2023, So I would contest that people are talking it up, and they're saying, yeah, of course they want to be seen to be busy, because a lot of these people, and again, don't get me onto this, but we're going down this route, so we'll talk about it anyway, is they're all, a majority are backed, are financially backed, VC backed. We're organic. So does that make me bitter and twisted? No, it doesn't make me bitter and twisted, but it just makes me a bit more real, facing some real world issues, is that actually, you know, I don't have to make a certain amount of money every month to be able to keep my, you know, my backers, my venture capitalists or my private equity backers happy. Because I'm the backer, I'm the person that needs to be kept happy. So yeah, do I need to talk up a good game? Yeah, of course I do. But also, I'm a realist. And I'm in it for the long term. I'm not in it to get to a certain level of finance to then to be able to sell it on to somebody else.
We've definitely seen a tech bubble in investment, and we're going to see what happens and whether that comes home to roost in the next few years.
I was wrong. I thought in COVID, I thought some of these guys would fall off the ledge, but they're not. They're here. So, but now it'll be interesting. Is you know, strenuous test number 2 coming up? It'll be interesting to see who's in a good
and
position.
If they don't have the margins, and I guess there might be more consolidation. People,
and that's definitely happening.
Surviving through
that is
acquisition.
Definitely.
There's another consensus, another sort of hymn sheet come out that everyone seems to have learned. There's 3 things that are going to survive tech-wise through the recession. Firstly, ESG. You know, climate sustainability. It's such a high priority for property corporates, in particular. So anything that has an ESG angle will still be investable and buyable. Then you've got future of work, going back to the hybrid thing, the revolution, it's here to stay. So flex office, co-working, anything around improving environments, space as a service, the branding point you were making. And then thirdly, operational excellence. So that can mean running your business better, AI and data, you know, having a tool that can do some research that used to take a team of grads 2 weeks to look into that market, whether you should open there or build a building there, that can now be done in minutes or hours, obviously has a compelling case to make. So we see you know, those as surviving. And then the layer of sort of business context over the top of that, picking up on your point about VC backed and margins and profitable and things, that there are property companies that want to buy, no matter about the pains of adoption and fulfilling the promise of putting it across the portfolio. But they want ready-made, established, solid track record. We've got clients, we've been going a while. Sounds like somebody I know. You know, they want those companies. They don't want a startup because they're going into a more cautious mode. They've got to be conservative. They've got to be more risk averse. So it's not a great time to be starting up. You know, arguably, all the companies that we need exist. Like all the tech that we need for climate change exists. We don't need more inventions. We just need the deployment of it.
Yeah, to just get on and do it.
Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because there are still funds and still startups.
So. Oh yeah. It's interesting talking about that, because and then looking forward. So the two questions for you here. One is, do you see the landscape of these cities changing? Because again, we operate quite a few sort of big commercial buildings, and also some sort of medium-sized commercial buildings. And the ones that are not in the right locations, the ones that do not have the amenities, the ones that do not have that whole sort of hybrid work setup, are the ones that are going, what are we going to do? And are the landlords then saying, we're going to sell, or we're going to spend a bucket load of money on
cities?
So, but is that going to change? And also, you've now got, you know, the occupancy levels. Most people are deliriously happy with 45, 50% occupancy levels. They were never 100 during the heyday. So don't get me wrong. So we're talking about, you know, 75, 70% occupancy. But we're now down to sort of 50, 45%.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky. If you've got a super place which is really close to transport network or link or whatever it is, and you then got all the facilities around that. But for those buildings that are not in that category, are they facing a really tricky year, 2 years? And what will happen? Will the landscape of these inner cities change? And don't forget, you've still got all the people that are then feeding off all the people coming in. So all the cafes, the restaurants, the pubs, the clubs, all that stuff. That whole network then, if it hasn't already faded away, are we looking at even more of a doomsday scenario?
Most cities have always had an amount of stock that has a question mark over it, that is outdated, not fit for purpose. Grade C, Grade D offices and secondary retail, whatever the use class. There's always been things that need repositioning, repurposing. That question mark's got bigger, and it's a black marker. It's not a pencil anymore, and so that hasn't changed. It's just sort of got worse for those buildings, really. You're going to see a lot more change of use. You're starting.
So that's where it goes.
Yeah,
surely.
But cities have been around for thousands of years.
They have.
And there used to
and
be
they morph.
there used to be horse and cart outside, and there was probably a warehouse where we're sitting, and they've changed, and they will change again. It doesn't mean the death of cities.
No.
It might mean more residential. It might mean more schools and amenities and proper facilities in city centres. It could be that there's a flight to quality, and that probably means scale in terms of the rise of some global cities that we're already seeing in some parts of the world, that the population growth is just ridiculous in some of the big cities. So that puts then some pressure on. That's
the sort of the landscape of changing face of cities, which we've covered in a couple of minutes, which is good. In terms of prop tech, what do you see happening over the next sort of 2 or 3 years in that sector? What are people telling you?
Other than what I've already said about ESG and future of work and operational excellence, I think people really need to crack on now.
You said there's going to be a consolidation.
It maybe hasn't happened as much in the last couple of years as people thought, but there has been some consolidation. There'll probably be some people running out of runway, out of cash, and I mean the toll that it must take. I can't imagine. I don't think I've got the constitution for VC fundraising rounds, and no sooner do you finish raising that you start again. And how do you keep the business going? I don't know how people do it, and fair play to them, but not my cup of tea. And then you lose more and more control each time. But people have got to start winning clients, and they've got to put some wool on their backs and make some cash. Build the margins into what they're doing. And maybe there's been a bit too much sort of feature selling, rather than just sort of really nailing 1 or 2 things really well, but going in and saying we do 16 things. It's a confusing.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is. We're seeing this as that people are beginning to tire of the complexity of these and the cost of these things, and actually, as you said earlier, sort of going back to the more sort of low tech. What's relevant for me and what can I actually get my head around is something which is I think coming slowly down the road, and I think it'll be further fast tracked as we go into this sort of economic downturn, because people don't not want to do the digitalization. They understand the benefit from it, but they're just not prepared to pay the ridiculous sums that some of these people are charging. So and also having the capacity, the resource within to manage it,
within especially these small independent family run property companies. That they've got a few people that run it. Who's going to sort out the data ethics policy for using AI? Who's going to
exactly?
It's it's as if property needs to go back to university. There's a lot of surveyors and architects qualified 20 years ago, not knowing that they'd have to monitor energy consumption and know about kilowatt hours in the way that they do, and you know, that's just one area. So if you think of everything that needs to change and all the electric vehicles, and you know, there's so many big things that have to change now. That the upskilling is a huge movement that's got to sweep through, and we think the media has a role to play in educating, especially that small and medium size tranche that doesn't have dedicated innovation teams. Where are they going to figure it out? They've got to be able to read stuff for free, like us at PlaceTech, to understand what's out there, what the best-in-class products look like, what some of the jargon means, what case studies look like, who else
is appropriate, and then understand what's appropriate for them.
Yeah, exactly, and where to start, and you know, hopefully we're signposting them in the right direction. But it's all a conversation, and we're just trying to bring people to the conversation. We think there's a more efficient, better way of doing property, and I think there's slowly but surely more people waking up in property and saying, right, I'll try something new. They've seen it in other industries. You know, we don't need to rehearse that argument about how property is slower than other sectors. But they know that it's coming. It's only going to go one way. Property is going into a tech era like everything else.
It is. So get on board.
May as well get ahead of it.
Yeah, I agree.
Be on the right side of history.
Paul, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Enjoyed that.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
And
thank you, Guy.
we'll see you soon.